Back to the Future, one of the most charming and memorable movies to come out of a decade that transformed entertainment in ways we still don't fully understand. In Back to the Future, a scientist named Doc Brown makes a time machine out of a DeLorean, which accidentally takes his teenage assistant Marty McFly back in time 30 years. Many hijinks ensue, and you better believe Marty causes trouble, especially where his then teenage parents are concerned. But after some elaborate scheming and a dash of fear of being wiped from existence, Marty gets his parents to fall for each other. In the final act of the movie, Marty, with the help of a young Doc Brown, strings together a Rube Goldberg-style Deus Ex Machina, and thanks to some well-timed lightning, Marty and his DeLorean time machine go back to the future. But what if he hadn't? What if Marty didn't stamp his ticket back to 1985? Today, we pick through the half-baked napkin-scrawled ruminations left to rot on the cutting room floor. Today, we pretend Marty's timing was just a hair off trying to get the DeLorean to receive its supercharged assist back to the future. Today, we write about what could have happened next if Marty McFly got stuck in 1955. Staring up at the night sky, trying to focus through the lockup of his musculature and the ringing in his ears, Dr. Emmett Brown faintly discerned a distant sound akin to glass shattering under the impact of great mass traveling at high speed.
Fascinating. How typical are auditory hallucinations in cases of electric shock?
Doc Brown's mind slowly returned to form, plotting the workings of future experiments as he felt the connections between neuron and tissue slowly reestablish. As he slowly turned his head to the side, his cheek resting on the pavement, he began to discern a peculiar shape in front of the town theater. No, not in front of it. Inside of it. Sitting beneath the shattered door frames of the feature film theater was the boxy metallic frame of the DeLorean automobile from 1985. Doc and Marty had failed. All at once, Emmett Brown's bodily functions returned as the wave of adrenaline that sent him running to the DeLorean sent his rational and methodical thoughts into a panicked frenzy. Doc Brown slid to a halt in front of the DeLorean machine as it sputtered and coughed itself into silence. Marty propped open the door to the DeLorean, with all the color draining from his face.
Doc, hey, it's so good to see you. How did you know to meet me here? Doc, how did you know to meet me here?
I'm sorry, Marty, but nothing for you has changed. You are still in 1955.
Marty clasped his hands around his head, staring off into the distance as his composure was destroyed by the force of a tidal wave.
Don't give it to me like that, Doc. There's gotta be something you can do. Let's give it another spin. Like, that wire might still have some juice in it. Like, come on.
Our chance is past, Marty. We need to get out of here before someone sees all of this.
As Doc Brown backed the flatbed trailer into the street, Marty leaned into the steering wheel, his mind swimming. Thoughts of his family, of his life in 1985, of Jennifer, of traveling back in time, and now this, all blended and blurred into an indiscernible cacophony of noise that rattled Marty's mind. The din of noise and static could have put Doc's CRM amplifier to shame. Marty was jostled back to reality by Doc vigorously shaking him to attention.
Get the car loaded, Marty! Quickly!
The next day, Doc and Marty returned to the scene of the crime, watching from afar as police and city workers mop up the wreckage of the obliterated front of Town Theater. As pedestrians and policemen pace up and down the street scorched by burnt DeLorean rubber, trying to make sense of an utterly preventable accident, Doc and Marty speak in hushed tones about what led to a now unpreventable actuality. Though they had been fortunate enough to clear away the evidence of their botched experiment, the truth of the matter was as plain to see as the blown-out doors of the movie theater. Marty was stuck in 1955, and as far as anyone could tell, there was no way out. Marty laments their failure. How could it have gotten screwed up? They had everything figured out. They had everything they needed to pull it off right down to the timestamp. It should have been perfect. Doc hypothesizes that though Marty and the Lightning made contact with the wire at the same time, the passage of electricity through objects could never have been properly gauged. Nature works in volatile ways, and under the circumstances, a fraction of a second could have made all the difference. And it would seem that yesterday, at 10:04 p.m., it did. Marty bemoans his bad luck as he slowly starts to realize that he may never see his family again, or his friends, or Jennifer. God, what he would do to see her smiling face again. Doc takes Marty by the shoulders, looking deep into his eyes, telling him that no matter what it took, he was gonna find a way back. Last night's failure was not the end. One way or another, they would get Marty back to the future. As the two leave the town square, heading back to Doc Brown's home, we see someone watching the two make their exit. Standing alone in front of Lou's Cafe, delivering a silent, furious glare into the side of Marty's head, was Biff Tannen. And behind his glare was the mind of a man preparing for war. Marty found himself skirting around the walls of the cafeteria of Hill Valley High School, doing everything he could to not draw attention to himself as he looked for a quiet corner to sit down. Over and over, Doc had given Marty the speech about not leaving the house even more intensely than when they first met. As he put it, Marty had gotten very lucky in getting his parents to fall for each other, and any further meddling from that point onward would have even more disastrous consequences. But Marty couldn't help himself, just as he couldn't help trying to save Doc from his fate. For over 2 weeks now, Marty had been able to do nothing except pace up and down the stairs, snack on ham and cheese sandwiches from Lou's Cafe, and watch Doc in his day and night attempts to try and find a new way home. Every waking minute of the day, Doc alternated between listening to radio and TV broadcasts, coupling together bits and pieces of old inventions, poring over makeshift blueprints, or going out for indeterminate amounts of time to do God knows what. All of it to try and get Marty home, as he put it. Yet none of it was working. Any effort Marty made to reach out to Doc regarding anything other than his work was met with the cold shoulder. Even in the company of one of his most trusted friends, Marty had never felt so alone. He snuck out of the mansion when Doc wasn't watching. Not that he ever was anymore. Marty didn't know what else to do. His mind was blank, unwilling to accept that this old-timey copy of his hometown might very well be the one he was stuck with for life. His mind drifted back to his parents. For all their irritating flaws, they had always been a constant through the highs and lows of everything he'd ever known. Something in him believed that if he saw for himself that his effort to bring them together was blossoming into the life that they would share together, then maybe, just maybe, it would bring him a little peace of mind.
Hey, Marty!
Marty froze in place as the booming voice of Biff Tannen echoed through his body. The one other constant in his life, though this one he could very much do without.
Do you remember getting my permission to be here?
Marty's head sunk down, with every muscle in his body tightening up like a rubber band as it did. Of all the people that could have seen him there, why did it have to be him?
Pay attention when I'm talking to you, butthead!
Biff's iron grip turned Marty on his feet. Now he was face to face with the hulking, slack-jawed frame of the man who was just as grating as a barrel-chested teenager as he was as a pot-bellied middle-aged man.
Biff, give it a rest. What?
I never got finished with you at the dance, so you got two choices. We can finish this up outside right now, or you can get a look at what you did to my car when I run you over with it.
As Marty stared through Biff's aimless, empty gaze, he noticed the usual entourage of greasers that substituted his shadow were nowhere to be seen. It seems Biff lost more than just his fight that night. There was no real purpose behind Biff's pig-headed prodding. He was as lost and confused as Marty was after that night. And in a way not so different from Marty, he was getting desperate.
Get lost, Biff.
Are you really stupid enough to walk away, you little snot?
As Biff began shoving Marty through the cafeteria, something started bubbling up inside him. All those years of abuse and torment Marty watched his family go through at Biff's hand all flashed into his mind at once, all brewing together in a red-hot fog of rage.
Do you not have the guts to finish what you started? Stand up and prove you're man enough to...
Biff's block-headed blabber was cut short as Marty threw him into a cafeteria table. Biff's tall and imposing stature was little more intimidating than a rag doll now, as Marty fastened his grip around his neck, pinning him to the tabletop. All of those years of pent-up anger began pouring out all at once. Marty brought his fist up in the air, readying himself to punch Biff through the floor.
Klein! Tannen!
A slender, bony hand gripped Marty by the wrist, spinning him around with unexpected speed and strength. Both Marty and Biff slumped low now, for the hand belonged to none other than Mr. Strickland.
My office! Both of you! Now!
As Strickland escorts the ruckus causers out of the cafeteria, all eyes are on them. But the gaze of one boy strikes harder than others. The boy who had nearly been flattened by Biff's fall had been working on a sketch of the beautiful brown-haired girl sitting with George and Lorraine 3 tables away. The sketch, which he had hoped to show that girl, along with a note he had written about the stunning nature of her beauty, was now covered in lunch milk, sopped and ruined. He wouldn't forget this anytime soon, and he would make damn sure Marty wouldn't either.
Weather for Hill Valley this week shows bright and sunny days ahead, with a high of 65 degrees tomorrow with cloudless skies. Wednesday brings with it a high of 61 degrees.
Doc Brown's attention is pulled from the radio as his garage door flies open. He runs to meet a fuming Marty as he passes the threshold, leaving the radio he'd spent the entire day listening to as new concerns manifested in an already frazzled thought process.
Great Scott! Marty, where in the world have you been?
Out and about.
Marty pushed past Doc Brown, throwing his bag to the floor next to the DeLorean as he went to lean against the hood. His eyes were downcast as he focused on putting out the fire in his belly. For the first time since meeting the young man, Doc Brown found himself afflicted with a new feeling towards him. This feeling was one of scorn. Emmett had fully committed himself, body and mind, to finding a new way to get this boy back where he belonged. He'd pored over newspapers, radio broadcasts, and television day and night, putting together any scrap of data he could in hopes of finding a new way home. He'd taken any scrap of material he could get his hands on in a hope against hope to slowly accumulate or replicate the conditions needed for him to even begin a thesis. He had spent all of his time for nearly a month attempting to achieve the impossible, and all he had to show for it was a haphazard pigsty of experimental detritus and a moody teenager actively undoing any hope of progress he hoped to make. It would no longer do for this self-involved child's testosterone to jeopardize his efforts.
Do you have to cause me grief in a time like this? I would think a person who was nearly erased from existence would have the mental acuity to avoid further interfering in affairs.
Well, I guess neither of us are very good at listening then.
Marty had had just about enough of Doc shutting him out. No matter what way he tried, he couldn't get the Doc to listen to him about what happened in 1985. Why couldn't he understand how important this was?
What must I say for you to understand the consequences of your actions? Your very presence here is a danger to everything. There is no possible way to understand the full extent of how much damage could be done. Until we find a way back, you absolutely cannot.
Yeah, and what happens when we don't find a way back? Huh, Doc? It's not like we can grab a stick of plutonium from the corner drugstore, so what are we supposed to do? Who am I kidding? You can't fix this even if you wanted to. I don't have a chance of making it home.
Emmett paused for a moment. Whatever Newtonian force was weighing on Marty's mind was clearly beating him down. Emmett steeled himself to implement a method that he was hopelessly unqualified to practice, talking to him man to man.
Marty.
Doc leaned against the side of the car, searching for Marty's gaze.
I am sure that what you're experiencing right now is harder than anything anyone can imagine. You are living and breathing in a time where you don't even exist. No amount of data can even begin to describe just how extraordinary it is that you are here.
Marty looked up from the hood of the DeLorean, finally meeting the Doc's gaze.
But you have to understand that according to that same data, this has never been done before. The tools I have to penetrate the fabric of time and space are about as useful as a chopping axe would be at splitting an atom. This is not a problem we will overcome by rushing headlong into it.
Doc placed a hand on Marty's shoulder, attempting to radiate an air of reassurance as he spoke.
We must be patient. We must keep calm and open minds. If we can do that, then just maybe the solution will come to us.
He poked Marty in the head, as he always did when he waxed poetic about the apple that gave Newton his inspiration in the field of physics. Marty's smile grew. The fog that clouded his senses was slowly lifting. As long as he had Doc in his life, he knew no obstacle would be too much for him. And it was for that reason his thoughts were plagued with the guilt that he couldn't tell Doc about their run-in with the terrorists. But as Doc put it, Marty would need to be patient if he hoped to get through to him.
So, about getting me back. How's that search going?
Oh, it's like trapping lightning in a bottle. How are your parents?
Can't take their eyes off each other.
Marty breathed heavily, thinking back to the image of his mom and dad in the school cafeteria, hands entwined, staring at each other like they were the only people in the entire world.
You know, Doc, never minding that this was the craziest thing I've ever done, I'm glad we got that right.
I'm happy to hear it, but as I have said...
Yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. Strickland suspended me for the rest of the year. I won't be seeing anyone I know anytime soon.
In that moment, as if the universe itself stepped in to refute Marty's claim, there was a knock on the door. Doc and Marty's eyes met. Before either had blinked, a tarp was thrown over the DeLorean, and Marty peeked through the door, sighing at what lay beyond.
Who is it?
Doc whispered.
My dad.
Marty's shoulders slumped. Looks like he wasn't as home free as he thought.
I'll send him off. You just keep doing what you're doing.
Before Emmett could respond, Marty had cracked the door and slipped outside, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Emmett Brown idly walked back over to the radio, absent-mindedly preparing to turn it off. But, with no other apparent course of action to pursue, and with burnt-out synapses that no longer followed the orders given to them, Doc allowed his mind to deviate off course. He seated himself on the stool next to the radio, leaning back and letting his mind be swept away by the voice inside the little electronic box.
And they continue to see a steady number of visitors at the Hoover Dam, following its classification as one of 7 American engineering marvels by the American Society of Civil Engineers earlier this year. With the ability to generate 1.25 gigawatts of power, this landmark of America serves as the workhorse that powers 3 United States.
As Marty stepped out the door into the evening sun, he immediately found himself face to face with George. He had stopped by to tell him how sorry he was to see him get suspended for putting Biff in his place, and wanted to know if he was doing okay. Marty spins a yarn about how his uncle Doc Brown was in the middle of a big project that he needed help on, so it really worked out fine for him. George tells Marty that he and Lorraine were about to head over to Lou's Cafe if he wanted something to lift his spirits. Though Marty thanks him for thinking about him, he tells him he's tied up tight in his uncle's project, and that he really needs to get back to helping him. As George departs, and Marty heads back inside, we see a figure watching the actions unfold from down the street. It is revealed that the figure belongs to the boy from the cafeteria. The boy stares through Marty even as the door closes behind him. He was raring to give him more than just a piece of his mind. He wouldn't let him get away with what he did. But he would have to wait until the time was right. The garage was a flurry of motion as Marty returned his attention to the now frenetic Doc Brown throwing together various implements and papers into various cases and bags. To say Marty was nothing short of bewildered would have been as inadequate as calling his kiss with his mother scarring.
Everything okay, Doc?
Emmett, being reminded of the existence of a world outside of his infernal state of hyperactivity, scurried over to Marty. Brown took him by the shoulders with a grip that should not have been possible for a man slim enough to make Marty's skateboard look like a tree trunk.
Yes, maybe. I don't know yet. I need to go out of town for a few days. There's a lead I need to pursue.
Marty stood dumbstruck.
What do you mean by a lead, Doc? Are you saying what I think you're saying?
Oh, it's going to take more than just a miracle to acquire the necessary resources. But if I can secure them, then it will be just what we need to get you back.
Marty's heart soared. A way back? There was, in fact, an all-knowing lab coat sporting savior walking the earth, and its name was Emmett Brown.
Oh, Doc, you're a genius. An absolute genius. I'll go pack up my stuff, and then we can...
Doc spun on his heels, once again seizing Marty in his iron grip.
Marty, you are not going anywhere. It is imperative that you do not leave this house again.
But, Doc, this is my ticket back we're talking about. I have to be there for that.
Marty, you've already seen for yourself how catastrophic your presence in Hill Valley has been. To take you across the country under such conditions could lead to unknowable damage. I'm sorry, Marty, but until I am certain of this...
Not screw with anything or anyone. Yeah, I know.
Keep a close eye on Copernicus for me. You'll find him to be something of an escape artist.
Marty followed Doc's glare over to the four-legged furball as his head perked up from its spot on the floor.
Remember, Marty, calm and open mind. I'll see you in a few days.
Doc.
But before he could figure out what he was even trying to say, the door slammed, and for the first time since arriving in this strange copy of his hometown, he was truly alone.
Well, here we are.
Though George mustered a smile for the passenger in the back of Mr. Baines' car, he trembled ever so slightly as he put the car into park. Never minding the fact that this was his first time driving a car, one that was very much not his. This would be his first time inviting not one, but 2 girls over to his home after dark. George hoped that Marty would accept the invitation to come with them. Though that mystery man had done everything short of turn George's life completely upside down, he had never felt better. But he would feel much better if his attempt to play matchmaker between Marty and the newly smitten Betty proved successful. Another first for a shy, scrawny kid who only a month prior could barely put together a sentence in the company of a girl. Then again, this past month had been full of firsts for George. He almost didn't want to believe it was real, for fear it would disappear out from under him.
Ready to go get him, George?
As Lorraine rested her hand on George's arm, he felt all his worries slowly begin to evaporate. This life was his. He had nothing to be worried about. As the headlights switched off and the trio exited the car under the light of the newly risen stars, it seemed Betty couldn't vacate the back seat fast enough. Though she, like many of her peers, had felt a vague romantic intrigue for Marty since his mysterious arrival, her fascination had now evolved into a full-fledged fixation. Though Biff was by no means selective with who he tormented, he seemed to display a special kind of dedication when making Betty's life miserable. Many years of pulled hair, hallway tripping, and unpleasant locker surprises were only a portion of what Betty had endured at Biff's hand. When Marty raised a hand against him, in front of everyone at school no less, Betty knew that she would have to become more familiar with Marty, no matter how shy and nervous she might have been about it. The trio, caught up in idle chatter, ignored the faint sound of barking from within the house as they approached the front door. Though Lorraine wore a smile as she looked up at George, a feeling of uneasiness lingered. Since her late-night affair with Marty in the car, something had changed. That feeling of wrongness being close to him had lingered past that night, and she didn't know if she was ready to see him again, even if whatever romantic connection the two might have had was no more. Though she secretly hoped he might reject the offer to go back to George's, it was important for both George and Betty to have this work, so she would do her best for their sake.
Who the hell are you?
The trio froze in their tracks, just feet from the front door, stopped in place by the abruptness of the words that sounded out from behind the oak panel.
Hey, get back here!
The sound of fast footfalls resounded from the grassy field beyond the house walls. The trio drew towards the corner of the exterior wall, fixated on the idea of whoever or whatever would come barreling around that corner. All at once, a figure burst from behind the corner, a blur of wool sweater and jet black hair that barreled straight into Betty, sending both tumbling to the ground. The boy, slightly dazed, looked down at the girl he had all but flattened in his escape attempt. His eyes widened.
Betty?
Shocked silence was all the boy got to hear as George and Marty lifted him to his feet.
Who are you, huh? What the hell are you doing snooping around here?
Marty squared his shoulders, ready to take on this skinny boy who seemed about as imposing as an ant.
You shouldn't be here, pal. You could get in real trouble for this.
I'm calling for the police.
Lorraine chimed in as she made her way inside. As George, Lorraine, and Marty's voices continued, the world started going quiet for the boy with the jet black hair. His brain was going haywire as he tried to think of what to say, but nothing would come out. He had just plowed face first into the girl of his dreams, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. In a flash, he broke free of George's hand on his shoulder, running as fast as his legs would carry him down to Riverside Drive. As the strange boy made himself scarce, Marty looked on in utter confusion. What was he doing snooping around Doc's place? Doc never mentioned anything about having secret admirers.
This lead better be worth it.
As Marty and George helped Betty back to her feet, Marty took one final glance at the boy as he hit the street and disappeared from view.
Are you okay, Betty?
George put his hands around her, waiting nervously for her to speak.
Yes, George, I'm okay. I just need to sit for a moment.
As Marty and George led Betty over to the doorstep, Marty piped up, still curious about the scrawny skulker.
What's the deal with that guy anyway?
George shrugged as he struggled to put a name to the face.
I don't know, really. I think his name's Danny. He goes to school with us, but I don't know anything about him.
Mostly keeps to himself from what I've seen. He's not someone you can expect to see for long after the bell rings.
Betty chimed in, wearing a less than impressed look on her face.
I always wondered what he would do with his time outside of school.
Well, I guess attempting break-in is your answer.
Marty shook his head. Even for Marty, it wasn't that unusual for guests to show up unannounced, but it sure helped if you actually knew the person before they came to visit. As George went inside to tell Lorraine to call off the cops, Marty sat with Betty on the front step, checking to see if she was feeling better. Betty took notice of the object in Marty's hand, focusing on that in an effort to block out the pain flaring up her sides.
What is that?
Oh, this old thing.
Marty looked down at the 24-string lute he had somehow held on to through the entire incident.
I've been trying to practice on it. I left my guitar at home, and, Doc doesn't have anything newer than the Declaration of Independence here.
Betty giggles at the quip, asking Marty if he could play a song on it. Marty sits down on the step with her, beginning to pick away at this Renaissance instrument, doing what he could to the tune of one of the first songs he ever learned, House of the Rising Sun. Though Marty does not see it through his attempts to stay on cue, Betty smiles while staring into his face, letting her mind take him and her through a whirlwind of dreams played out to the tune of the world's funniest-looking strings. After a minute of melody that seemed to carry on for eternity, George and Lorraine return. Though George makes his offer to Marty to come over to his place, just the four of them, Marty declines. He tells George that if he's gonna have any more uninvited guests, he'd better be there to keep an eye on Doc's research. Though they offer to stay with him and keep an eye on things together, Marty rejects this as well, saying they probably don't need to risk any more excitement for the night and should just go enjoy themselves.
Yeah, all right. We'll see you later, Marty. Don't be a stranger.
George smiles as he turns around and begins the walk back to Mr. Baines's car. Marty watched the trio from the door, watching his mom wrap herself around George's arm. He had to smile at the sight. He couldn't remember the last time he saw his parents so happy together. As Marty stepped back inside, watching from the window as the car that started this whole mess drove away, he found himself thinking about his life back home. Mom, Dad, Dave, and Linda all flashed through his mind, and the thought of them put him at ease. But another face burst through, leaving everything else on his mind in the dust. Jennifer. Wavy hair, piercing brown eyes, her smile, that killer smile. Marty felt himself going weak in the knees just thinking about it. His girl. The one who'd always been by his side since the second grade. The one who was always there to cheer him on as he would shred away at his guitar. The one who in every way Marty could imagine was the one. Now fully consumed by thoughts of the angel he left in the future, Marty pulled out the clock tower flyer with the note she sent him off with. I love you, 555-4823. Marty had plenty of time to memorize that note, to memorize the reason he and Doc had worked so hard to send him back. Marty looked upon the looping handwritten note, and in an instant, felt his heart sink down into his shoes. The I in I love you had disappeared from the page.
Why is this happening to me?
Marty paced back and forth through the house while Copernicus's eyes lazily followed him, waiting for an indication that breakfast was about to be served.
I've barely gone anywhere. I've barely done anything. How could this be happening?
Marty tried to relax himself by putting some food in Copernicus's bowl. No automatic system for that in 1955. But the harder he tried to empty the can, the less the food inside seemed to budge.
Wasn't it enough that I had to save myself? I made my parents hook up, for crying out loud. What the hell am I supposed to do about this?
The food suddenly came pouring from the can, with half of it finding the bowl, and the other half splashing across Marty's socks. Nothing was working. Nothing did what it was supposed to do. Not even the stupid can of dog food. Marty hurled the can across the kitchen with all his strength, sending it careening through the glass of a nearby window, shattering it to pieces.
Why can't I catch a goddamn break?
Almost as if he meant to chime in, Copernicus started growling. He stood from his place on the floor and began barking wildly at the door as if it were the embodiment of evil incarnate.
And what's got you so excited?
Peeking through the sidelight of the entrance, Marty felt his stomach tie itself in a knot. Stepping out from the back of a slick black convertible was the black-haired boy from before. But this time, he wasn't alone. On the boy's right, Biff Tannen lumbered towards the doorstep, while behind them, his gang of goons had found it in their hearts to accompany him. It seemed Marty wouldn't be catching his break today. Biff began banging on the door, rattling its frame as Copernicus's frenzy of barks and showing of teeth continued. Marty didn't have a hope in hell of facing all of them. If he wanted to avoid the beating of a lifetime, he would have to be smart about what he did next. Luckily for Marty, smart was the one thing Biff was not. The front door exploded inward under the force of Biff's size 11 shoe. The steadfast guard dog decided being brave was no longer worth the effort, and took off into the bowels of the mansion. Biff stepped inside, followed close behind by his boys, now accompanied by a scrawny kid promising to help them get their hands on Marty. The quintet separate, upturning every strange machine and piece of furniture they can lay their hands on, raring to feed the wavy-haired punk from out of town a full-course meal of knuckle sandwiches. Adjusting his signature 3D glasses, one of Biff's gang makes their way up to the second floor. As he crests the top of the stairs, a curious sight meets him. Positioned at the top of the stairs, as if standing watch, was a complete suit of medieval armor, glinting in the mid-morning sun, polished and bright as if it had been plucked straight from a long-lost European battlefield. Amused by the odd sight, he moves in close, until the metal plate face is only inches away from his. In order to satisfy his self-indulgent mischief, he lifts up the faceplate, only to see a very human face staring back. A short yelp was all he could muster before the metal faceplate butted him in the head, knocking him out before he even hit the floor. The rest of the entourage was quick to respond as they all began to rush the knight from the bottom of the stairs. The knight sprung to life, and in the morning rays of sun, he came forth to meet the gaggle of goons with his lance. As he thrusted and waved, the kids held their arms up, fruitlessly trying to stand against the onslaught of wood and steel. Truly, it was a magnificent sight to see a knight of old, an immovable wall of metal, drawing on warrior's spirit to vanquish the foes who challenged him. But it soon became clear the steadfast defense was an empty threat. It would seem that despite the intimidating aura of the metal mask the knight wore, he could not see shit through it. The group acted quickly, grabbing hold of the lance during one of the knight's weaker strikes. Though the group are quickly able to free the weapon from its wielder, their victory is short-lived. Having returned his 3D glasses to his face, the fifth member of the party pounces on the knight's back, naively fantasizing about ripping the man straight out of his armor shell. The knight and his piggyback passenger, despite their best efforts, are soon tumbling down the stairs, straight towards the crowd of wide-eyed greasers. Before anyone knows what hit them, everyone is reduced to a pile of arms and legs squirming and groaning on the mansion floor. The armor-clad Marty is first to his feet, ready to put the bully Biff into his place. Biff quickly finds his way to his feet, his towering frame casting a shadow over Marty. He steps forward, pushing his target back, hardly fazed at all by being flattened by a mountain of metal. Marty finds himself trapped against a table too heavy to budge, facing down the brute with fire in his eyes and a piece of broken lance in his hand.
Now you're done for, you son of a bitch!
Marty's hand frantically explores the tabletop behind him, desperately feeling for something to defend himself. The only thing to meet his hand is a small cylindrical object. Without a second thought, Marty grabbed on tight and lunged for Biff's head. Marty's eyes locked with Biff's, still angry, still upright, but now with a small plunger stuck to his head. The goddamn brainwave analyzer. In the moment of stillness that followed, Marty turned, laying eyes on the dome-like helmet attached to the machine. He grabbed it, hurling it into Biff with all the strength his steel suit would allow. Biff dropped the lance, barely catching the metallic projectile before it could find its way through his chest. Marty wasted no time making a break for it, propelling the cabinet of the analyzer into the oncoming herd of Biff's goons. Though it only halted them for a moment, it was enough time for Marty to make his escape to the kitchen. Dodging lamps and figurines as they were hurled through the air, Marty grabbed at a mess of coiled-up wires laid out on the kitchen table, quickly tossing them to the floor before running for the side door. Biff, with smoke billowing out of his ears, ran blindly into the kitchen, only to trip over the spools of wire on the floor. Though he tried in vain to stop himself from falling, he could do nothing, as he tumbled face first into a mound of wet dog food. His gang stopped briefly, listening to him gargle on the disgusting sludge before continuing their chase. The remaining four, with the black-haired boy leading the charge, close in on Marty, now stuck at the door that would not budge. In one last-ditch effort to secure his escape, Marty grabs a large-framed portrait of Leonardo da Vinci, bringing it down on the head of the black-haired boy. The boy, now dazed and trapped in a canvas straitcoat, had stopped in his tracks, giving Marty just enough time to throw open the door and make a mad dash for the street. But halfway across the lawn, Marty froze. Biff's gang, seeing their opportunity to strike, closed the gap, only to freeze just short of Marty themselves.
Stop right there! All of you!
A sizable wad of dog food flew from Biff's mouth as he is shoved into the cramped back seat of the police car. Though the police were prepared to arrest everyone on the lawn, Marty explained that he called the police about the break-in and that he was an associate of Dr. Emmett Brown, the owner of the property. Though Marty offered to provide them with any proof they wanted, the police seemed satisfied enough, content with telling him to stay out of trouble as they turned to leave. Before they do, though, Marty calls after them, asking if they would mind helping him out of the armor, which was proving harder to get out of than it was to get into.
Honest to God, Doc, I think somebody has put a curse on me.
Marty paced back and forth, his mind swimming with panic and disbelief as he eyed Jennifer's note, with only a faded letter U from I love you remaining on the page. The only thing keeping Marty's mind tethered to reality were the words of Dr. Emmett Brown, having unexpectedly called him from a payphone in God knows where, and the occasional tug of the phone cable reminding him he was wandering too far.
I need you to stay focused, Marty. Tell me again, who have you interacted with these past few days? Think hard.
Well, aside from you and Strickland, there's Biff and his goons.
Marty glanced over at the large oak and glass panel, haphazardly leaned against the door frame. He'd have to pay Doc back on the repair bill later.
And then my parents for a minute or two. But I'm telling you, Doc, none of them are related to Jen. I'm positive.
Was there anyone else?
Well, there was some scrawny kid skulking around outside when my parents showed up. Now that I think of it, he was here with Biff earlier, too.
Who were they?
Dad told me it was, what was it, David? Or Donnie? No, Danny. It was Danny.
The Parker boy? What on earth was he doing there?
The Parker boy. Suddenly it clicked for Marty, sounding off in his mind like a boombox. Somehow, in the course of a couple of days, this scrawny punk who was supposed to be Jennifer's dad had now become Marty's sworn enemy. And if Marty couldn't set things right, it would cost both of them.
Doc, Parker? That's Jennifer's last name.
Great Scott! Marty, were you born with upside-down horseshoes?
Before Marty could form an answer, Doc, now with slightly more composure, spoke again.
All right, Marty. We have the father, but her mother is part of this equation too. Have you seen anyone else? Anyone at all?
Before Marty could recollect his thoughts, a sound rang out. A knock on the door, and there she was through the crack in the busted panel.
Yeah, I'm looking at her.
What does she want?
I don't know.
Listen to me carefully, Marty. If you want to set the future right, you're going to have to act quickly. I'll be back in Hill Valley at 8 p.m. tonight. You have to be ready to leave as soon as I get there.
Are you kidding me, Doc? 8 p.m.? How am I supposed to fix this by then?
The clock now ticked towards the 5 p.m. mark.
I'm sorry, Marty, but it was not my decision to make. I have found a way back, but if we hope to capitalize on it, then we have a limited window of opportunity to do so. Our backer is only allowing us one chance to attempt this.
Jeez, Doc, did you make this deal with Strickland?
Marty, what are you saying right now?
A second tap rang on the door, sending it heaving forward ever so slightly. Marty, having remembered his other uninvited guest, felt gears start to turn in his head.
Forget about it. I'll see you when you get back.
Good luck, Marty. And remember...
Yeah, 8 p.m. Don't be late. Got it.
No, Marty. Remember to...
The phone clanged on the receiver as Marty made his way over to the door, gingerly picking up the panel and moving it to the side, before meeting the gaze of the girl on the doorstep.
Hello, Marty.
As Marty found the glimmering, eager gaze of the girl before him, he saw it plain as day. Brown eyes. Brown eyes that caught the sun's rays and held them like the sun itself belonged to them. Brown eyes that, despite being the same shade as the dust and rust that made Hill Valley so dreary, was the most enchanting color in the world. Brown eyes that belonged to Jennifer. No doubt about it.
Hi.
Marty stammered out as he beckoned for her to come in.
Betty, right?
Betty stepped past the threshold, her gaze timidly falling to the floor, taking a piece of Marty's pounding heart with it.
I heard about what happened up here. I wanted to know if you were okay.
God almighty. That heart of gold that Marty saw in Jennifer when she snuck into detention to see him last month was beating just as strong in her mother here and now.
Oh, yeah, I'm fine. I'm great. Doc's actually gonna be happy about this. He's been itching to try some homemade security, so,
The butterflies that circled Marty's stomach reminded him of the ones he felt the first time he spoke to Jennifer in first-year science class. It seemed this was gonna be even harder to pull off than he'd hoped.
Wait, did you come alone? Where are Mom and Lorraine and George?
He must have looked redder than his mom's beet stew at this point.
They were heading to George's after school to study. I know you know each other better than me, but I don't want to see you sitting up here all alone. I can at least stay until your uncle gets back.
My uncle?
Yes, Dr. Brown. Lorraine told me you two were related.
Oh, right, my uncle. Yeah, I just call him Doc. It's what he's used to, you know?
Well, I don't mind staying here until Doc comes home. If there's two of us here, then I'm sure Biff and his boneheads will think twice about doing anything nasty.
Wait, why are you worried about Biff? He just got busted by the cops.
You didn't hear? They were all let go earlier today. Police said it was no use clogging up perfectly good cells with a bunch of dumb delinquents.
Marty was starting to see the pieces of a plan come together in his mind. If they released all of them, that meant Danny was still within reach. If Marty was careful and acted quick enough, then he just might be able to make this work.
Well, Betty, if I'm being totally honest here, there is something I could use a hand with. Of course. What is it? I'm kinda worried about Danny. I don't see why you wouldn't be. I would be worried about someone who took it on themselves to make nice with Biff Tannen. That's not quite what I meant.
Betty's head cocked to the side, waiting for his follow-up.
I need to talk to him. Talk to him?
Betty recoiled slightly, positioning herself closer to the door.
Why on earth would you want to talk to that lunatic about anything? Oh, come on, Betty. He's not a bad guy. He broke in here with Biff, Marty. Attacked you in your uncle's home. How could you possibly think that? Because...
Marty paused briefly, reaching deep for the best reserves of fast talk he could muster.
Because he's going through a rough time right now, and he is on the verge of making a very big mistake. Like you said, it's no good for him to be around Biff, and if someone isn't there to help him...
Marty was no longer comprehending anything coming out of his mouth. There was no sense letting his brain override what he was doing now. He had to work with what he was given.
So, if all he needs is someone to talk to him, why do you think we should be the ones to do it?
This was good. Marty had her attention now. Now just to seal the deal.
Because, Betty...
Marty stepped in closer, finding his eyes getting lost once again in the ocean of mesmerizing brown that waited for him.
You and I mean a lot to him. He might not know it yet, but you and I together will be very important parts of his life going forward. And if we can get through to him and help him see that...
Marty felt sparks igniting within him, the fires that stoked the love he had for Jennifer, and his need to see her eyes again made every syllable that rolled off his tongue hit like a last-round haymaker. As his eyes locked with Betty's, and the gaze of a woman waiting to be swept off her feet met his, he felt his emotions soar.
We can make a better future. For him, for you, and for me.
Marty suddenly became aware of his hand resting on Betty's shoulder, with only inches of space left between them, as her gaze once again fell to the floor, leaving Marty to question what he was doing.
Well...
Betty hesitated, pondering just how much she trusted what she was about to say next.
If you think it's worth the while... Oh, thank you, Betty. It'll be worth it. You'll see.
Marty paced up and down the perimeter of the town square, scanning the clusters of wandering townsfolk for any sign of the jet-black hair he was looking for. Betty told him that she and others had seen Biff, Danny, and the other punks split, heading to various places in town after being released by the police. Marty had yet to see any sign that he was there. Marty glanced down at his watch. Just past 5:30. Marty tapped his foot impatiently. He only had one shot to make this work, and time was slipping through his fingers. If only the DeLorean were working right. He could have just traveled back and forth as many times as he wanted. Sure would have saved a lot of time.
Is something wrong, Marty?
Betty had hardly taken her eyes off Marty since their walk downtown. Given the uninterrupted ticking of the clock looming over Marty, he would rather her smitten gaze be focused on finding her future husband.
Thought he was supposed to be here.
Marty clasped the back of his neck, trying and failing to think of what he was going to do if he couldn't find him.
Well, he was here, but he very well could have gone home by now. Do you know where he lives? What places he hangs around? Where could he have gone? Marty, if we don't find him, we can always look again tomorrow. Now what say you and I go for a...
Marty turned on his heel, pacing straight into Betty so they were once again inches apart. But the feeling radiating off Marty was much different now.
Look, Betty, this is a now or never moment, okay? It's hard to explain, but the longer we let this get out of hand... Marty, look, there he is.
Marty followed Betty's outstretched finger towards the front of Roy's Records, and sure enough, the sweater-clad lad with the jet-black hair was there, frozen in place as the door to the shop floated shut behind him. In a moment of silence, Marty and Danny's eyes locked, waiting to see who would make the first move. Marty broke the stalemate, taking long strides towards the boy. Danny was quick to respond, making his way towards the Texaco, picking up his pace with every passing step. He seemed just as set on being as far away from Marty as possible as Marty was in getting up close and personal.
Hey, Danny!
Danny said nothing as he kept his gaze fixed forward, refusing to acknowledge the pointed call from this stalker. Betty desperately worked to match Marty's pace as he found his legs carrying him forward ever faster.
Danny!
You don't know who I am. Leave me be.
Danny maintained his stride, passing the intersection by the Essex and making his way further down the street.
All I want is to talk. Can't we be reasonable?
I said leave me alone.
Damn it, Danny, I'm trying to help you.
Marty could feel the heat in his gut once more. Just one time, why couldn't someone listen to reason?
You and I have nothing to talk about. Now I'm warning you, leave me alone.
The boy turned a corner, sending Marty into a sprint. There was no way in hell he was about to lose sight of him. Betty, exasperated, followed suit, hoping to pull Marty back down to earth when this nonsense was over.
And what about Biff, huh? If you don't get away from him now, you'll be stuck with him forever.
In that moment, Marty turned the corner, finding himself face to face with none other than the human tower that was Biff, with Danny standing smugly at his side.
Well, if it isn't Prince Charming, Knight of the Round Table.
Biff sends a fist into Marty's gut, sending him meekly shuffling backwards. In that moment, Betty rounds the corner, colliding with Marty and sending them both tumbling to the pavement.
And you brought company. What a gentleman.
Two of Biff's gang lift Marty up by the arms while the third forces Betty to her feet.
Throw him in the trunk. Don't want to tag along for our little visit.
Though Marty kicks and thrashes, doing everything he can to break free, the grip of the two goons is just too much to break. Marty is thrown into the trunk, feeling a sharp pain in his back as he hits the spare tire. He tries to leap from the car, only to be met with Betty thrown in on top of him, pinning him to the bed of the trunk. Danny's eyes catch Marty's for the briefest of moments, and just for a second, A look of remorse flashes across the hapless boy's face. The trunk slams shut, now leaving the captives trapped in complete darkness. Goldie Wilson's ears perked up before he was even aware of what he was hearing. The sound of a commotion rarely led to anything good, even less so if he found himself in the middle of it. Though keen to know what he was hearing, he made a point of letting his gaze wander without landing on any specific place. Never let anyone catch you staring. That was a lesson he'd learned the hard way more than once. Just as he suspected, the racket was made by some punk teens with too much free time. Hardly a sight to behold, at least until he watched two of them being thrown into the trunk of a black 46 Ford. Now that was not something you saw every day. Goldie quietly made his way back up the street, watching the thugs over his shoulder to see how much further they planned to go. When he turned the corner, he ran for the doors of Lou's, nearly colliding with the man himself as he exited the shop.
Lou, I gotta talk to you.
What is it, Mr. Somebody? You hanging up the apron and making your run for mayor? Though Goldie was somewhat irritated at the disregard that continued even after hours, he kept his head on straight, maintaining the spring in his step as he continued.
You remember the manure boys from the other day?
As Lou scoffed, making an effort to walk past Goldie, he kept his stride.
They were off past the Texaco throwing people in their damn trunk a minute ago. We ought to let the cops know about that, don't you think?
Then how about you go get 'em? You wanted to clean up this town after all, didn't you? Lou knew damn well if Goldie could, he would have already been there and back with the police at his back in less time than it took to say it. But seeing as he couldn't be seen within pitching distance of the station without getting looks, he would need Lou's help. Unfortunately, this was Lou he was talking to. Don't be an idiot. They're just teenagers screwing around and being stupid to pass the time. Now get out of my way.
Come on now, Lou.
Goldie stepped in front of him, stopping him dead in his tracks.
You go to the cops and bust that Tannen kid for abducting people, you'll be the talk of the town. Lawman Lou, whipping up malts and whipping down punks since 1895.
Lou cocked his head to the side, staring intently through Goldie as he waited for him to clear out. Goldie took one final shot.
Sir, if we catch those boys, and it turns out it was nothing, I will clean the counters, windows, floors, hell, even the toilets, every day until you see your reflection in them. How's that?
As Goldie finished regaling a bored and irritated Lou with his speech, Lou saw Biff Tannen's convertible over Goldie's shoulder, tearing down Main Street towards Town Theater. Two boys alternated between slapping on the trunk and cupping their ears to it. As the irritating sounds of the boys' ruckus faded, Lou looked back up at Goldie.
Someone needs to tell the cops about them. Morons running around like they own this town.
As he turned towards the police station, Goldie smiled, silently dancing in place before moving to accompany Lou.
Are you okay?
Marty felt Betty stir, the cramped trunk feeling all the more suffocating as she let her full weight lean into him.
I think so. Oh, Marty, where do you suppose they're taking us?
Marty felt himself sweating again, although he couldn't see much in the darkness of the trunk. He could still feel the expectant eyes of the young woman perched on top of him. For having just been abducted without warning by the town's scumbag, she didn't seem as put off as she should have.
Honestly, Betty, I don't have a clue.
The flurry of emotions that had been throwing Marty around for the past week had finally began to die down as they gave way to the worst of them all. Sadness. It was all just too much to take. How did he end up stuck 30 years in the past? His parents' lives, his own future, his friend Doc Brown, all of it was disappearing right before his eyes. He was never gonna go back to the future. Not a chance. No chance to see his family again. No chance to save Doc from the death that was now sure to take him. No chance to get out of school and start his own life. And Jennifer, not only would he never get a chance to see her again, but she would never get a chance to see anything at all. She was as good as gone, and there wasn't a damn thing Marty could do to stop it.
Oh, Marty.
Betty's head sunk into Marty's chest as her arms wrapped around him. A shivering embrace that drew little comfort within the captivity of their motorized cage.
Promise me you'll look after me. Promise me you won't let that brute do anything to us. Will you promise me? I'm sorry, Betty. I thought I could fix this.
Marty slipped out of the world, his mind going blank as the whirlwind of thoughts and feelings collapsed in on itself, leaving a blank slate in its wake.
But it's too late now.
The trunk flew open, and two leather-clad buffoons stood slack-jawed as they sized up the crumpled form of Marty McFly buried beneath Betty. Marty was unsure what Biff's intentions were. Up to this point, his antics had been crude and cruel, but at the very least, they'd remained predictable. This train of thought seemed utterly out of character for a guy like Biff. And to Marty, that was terrifying. As Marty was hurled from the trunk by Biff's gang, he saw that the sun had now crept below the horizon. How much time had passed? Where was Marty anyway? Marty reached for the clock tower flyer in his pocket, but was ushered to his feet before he could grab a firm hold. As he was pushed forward, he looked down as the paper fell from his pocket, stealing a glimpse of what remained. 23. That was all that was left of the note his love had left him. One crummy number that he couldn't reach her at even if he tried. 23. That was 6 years away for Marty. Where would he be at 23? What direction would his life take had things gone on the way they were meant to? Would he have started a new life beyond the boredom of what was high school? Would Jennifer still be there by his side, smiling away as he blew the world away with the rhythm of his guitar? Would he even be playing it by then? What would life have been like for him?
Hello? Anybody home?
Marty was snapped back to attention just in time to see the door of the old McFly house fly open, watching George and Lorraine stare back in a state of shock. Whatever was about to happen was gonna be bad.
What do you want, Biff?
Marty heard George suppress a stutter as he tried in vain to stand at the ready. He'd heard enough interactions with Biff from behind closed doors as a child to pick up on when Biff was being especially nasty. Marty got the feeling that none of those talks would hold a candle to what Biff was gonna do now.
You wanna know something, you slippery Irish bug?
Something in Biff's tone had changed. There was a low, bellowing quality to his voice now. This was no longer a bully harassing a victim. This was a predator seeking prey.
You are one lucky bastard. Knocking me on my ass when I wasn't ready? But you thought you could walk away after that, didn't you? You thought it was over after that, didn't you?
Lorraine clutched on to George's arm, her knuckles going white as she peered out from behind him. George's knees were shaking now. He gulped hard on the lump in his throat as the eyes behind the glasses became glassy themselves.
You think you could just walk away with my night? With my girl? All because you got lucky? Who do you think you are?
Marty bit down hard on his lip. If Biff was as far gone as Marty thought he was, then George McFly was about to have the worst night of his life. And that is if he was lucky.
Listen, Biff. Whatever you want from me, you can have, all right? Please, just leave my friends alone.
Why don't you come make me?
Lorraine stared up at Biff, eyes wider than dinner plates. She shifted her gaze to George, shaking her head vigorously. It should have been enough. It should have been the reality check George needed to see that he had to walk away. But George, for all his flaws, was smart enough to realize one thing. Biff had no plans to stop until he got what he wanted. George had stood up for what he knew was right. Now, he would have to fight for it. George broke from Lorraine's grip, lightly nudging her back towards the door as he stepped up to meet Biff, fists clenched. He was at the ready, but not at all ready for what was coming. It was too damn much. Marty averted his gaze. He didn't have it in him to watch the man who raised him get beaten to a pulp. As Marty tried to distract himself from the sickening sounds of knuckles hitting muscle, Marty noticed that all of Biff's goons were circled around Betty. Marty looked up to the sky, his gaze being greeted by the chin of Danny Parker, who held him down on his knees. Marty looked back over to Betty, whose eyes were there to meet him. She desperately probed his gaze, silently begging him to do something to stop this. Marty looked up, trying to find Danny's eyes.
Hey, what are you doing here, Danny?
Shut up. Danny's gaze remained locked forward. Marty stole a glance of the scene unfolding, just in time to watch George take a hard right cross to the temple. Marty was now beginning to feel queasy. His body was going limp, as if he were slowly being picked up and carried into the sky.
What are you doing here, Danny? You see what he's doing to him? Do you really want to be a part of this?
Just shut up!
For the love of God, please don't throw your future away for him. The only reason I'm even here is because of you. So if you know what's good for you, you will shut up. Wait, what?
Marty was having a much harder time keeping his thoughts together. His mind was clouding as his body continued to try and untether itself from reality.
That day in the cafeteria, when you picked your fight with Biff, Wait.
Marty now felt those familiar bubbles of anger forming beneath the cloud of confusion.
You're telling me you're angry because I picked a fight with Biff? I was planning on doing it there, on talking to her.
He looked over at Betty, her gaze cast into the ground, trapped in shock.
I wanted to tell her everything. I wanted her to know how beautiful I thought she was. It was supposed to be perfect. Because of you, I missed my chance. Now I don't have a chance.
Don't have a chance. Just like Betty didn't have a chance of comprehending a future with a boy who picked sides with her childhood tormentor. Just like George didn't have a chance of winning his fight, as he collapsed to his knees, his eyes swelling shut and blood staining his shirt. Just like Marty, as he glanced down at his hands, which were now fading out of existence. Just like the night his father almost walked away from his mother. Marty looked up at Danny once again. He saw Danny swallowing a lump in his throat, his eyes cast down. If it was possible to conjure miracles, Marty hoped he had it in him to do it now.
Danny! Look at me, Danny!
Danny's eyes shifted upwards, meeting Marty's as he awkwardly craned his neck to speak.
You do have a chance, Danny. Look around. This is gonna end up being one of the worst mistakes you ever make. But you can still stop it. You can set things right with Betty. If you want to stop this from being a night you regret for the rest of your life, then the time is now.
Danny took in his surroundings. To his right, the 3 greasy monkeys stood around the girl of his dreams, prodding and laughing at her as she buried her face in her hands. To the left, Lorraine, one of Betty's best friends, frozen in terror and anguish as George, his face bloodied and swollen, got up from the ground, putting his hands against Biff's chest in a final, feeble attempt to keep him away from his love. How did Danny get here, letting himself be dragged into something so horrible? All he wanted was to get back at Marty for ruining his proposal. Deep down, Danny couldn't admit that he was really angry at himself, not Marty. Marty was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. But Danny should have let it go. He should have tried harder, come forward and spoken his mind to Betty, rather than trying to make the perfect story. But what was he supposed to do now? Marty sighed. He needed Danny to help him, and he needed his help now. Lives, both present and future, were depending on it.
Listen, Danny, if you want to make this right, you're gonna have to go after Biff.
Are you crazy? I can't take Biff. He'll kill me.
No, he won't, because I'm gonna set you up trying to take a shot at him.
You're gonna take a shot at him? How in the world is that supposed to help me?
Because you're gonna take me down when I try. Are you ready?
What do you mean? Why would I—
Hey, Biff!
Biff whirled on his heels, his fist hanging up in the air, in position to take George down. Marty saw that his hands were slowly beginning to rematerialize. Good. He was gonna need them for what was up next.
Are you done here?
Biff stared blankly, the limp and gasping form of George tight in his left hand as his right hand still hung above.
No!
This caught Marty slightly off guard. There was certainly something to be said for Biff's bluntness, but Marty figured he could let his hands do the talking on that front.
Okay, can I go home?
All eyes were on Marty now, shock and disgust riddling the faces of those around him at his cowardly attempt to excuse himself from the horror unfolding.
You wanted a rematch with George, didn't you? You don't need me around for that. If you let me go, then I can just forget this ever happened. What do you think?
Biff cracked a grin, but there was no humor or kindness in the gesture. The blockhead really was only amused by all the wrong things.
Let me tell you how this works, butthead. When I'm through rearranging this little creep here—
His glance now shifted to Betty, a devious look flashing across his face.
—and me and my girls are back on the road again.
Betty thrashed and kicked, trying desperately to break free from Biff's gang.
I'm gonna bury you in the manure truck and watch you drown in it.
Marty sighed, his head tilting down for a moment before meeting Biff's gaze again. Marty wrestled free of Danny's grip, focusing every ounce of his energy on running down Biff. For the first time in Marty's life, he was hoping that he would be taken down. Biff allowed George to slip out of his grasp, squaring himself up to lay another beating. With only inches between them, Marty felt the full force of Danny's body ram into him, sending him face first into the dirt. Before he could react, he was rolled onto his back and greeted with a fist straight to his left eye. The hit knocked him into the ground, completely blurring the world around him and sending his vision swimming. As Danny loomed over the dazed Marty, he felt a beefy hand contact the back of his head with the force of a freight train.
Hello? Anybody home?
Danny sent his gaze up, now finding himself nose to nose with Biff.
You want to hold him down, you useless twig?
Danny's upset from the past few days transformed in a blink. He stared straight through the hollow and empty gaze of who had just become the bull to his matador. Without a moment's hesitation, Danny's hand closed into a fist and launched towards Biff's head. But it came to a sudden and violent stop inside Biff's vice-like grip. Biff now held Danny's fist in his hand, twisting and squeezing, leaving Danny unable to do anything but cry out in pain. Lorraine and Betty, having snapped out of their daze, ran at Biff in a vain attempt to stop him. Biff reached out, grabbing Lorraine in his free hand before throwing her into the oncoming Betty, sending both tumbling to the ground. As Marty felt the world coming back to him, he felt a shoe on his throat, leaving him to choke and gasp helplessly as Biff let out laughs of perverted glee. Danny's cries turned to screams, his wrist bending closer and closer to the breaking point. Marty's vision began to darken as he wheezed helplessly at the giant above him, crushing him underfoot. Suddenly, the sound of a fast and hard hit rang out. Biff's grin of deranged satisfaction quickly transformed into open-mouthed shock. His knees buckled as he stumbled towards the lawn. Marty and Danny were now free. George, whose face resembled a piece of scrambled meatloaf, had found his way back to his feet. The feet that had just found their way up and through Biff's groin. Biff squawked meekly as his hands reached down to soothe his mangled member. Biff's gang stood dumbfounded at the sudden and violent turn of events, and upon seeing all eyes turning back on Biff, decided they now had other places to be. With George, Danny, and Marty now back on their feet, the fight was on. Each took a swing at Biff, sending him stumbling in circles as he tried and failed to regain his bearings. Punch after punch found its way to Biff's body, sending the world around Biff spinning. Marty sent a blow into Biff's kidney, nearly taking him off his feet as he seized in pain. George landed a fist in Biff's stomach, doubling him over and bringing him to eye level with his foes. The final strike came when Danny sent a fist into Biff's lower jaw, snapping him up and bringing him down. Biff's eyes rolled up into his head, and he slumped down to the ground. Biff was beaten. While Marty took some time to catch his breath, George and Danny rushed to Lorraine and Betty, each one slowly regaining their composure. As Danny bends over to help Betty to her feet, a loose sheet of paper escapes from the pocket of his sweater. Betty catches it mere inches above the ground, giving her time to have a good long look at what was in essence a boy's heart in her hand. She looks up to Danny, who hides his gaze, afraid of what waits for him in Betty's eyes.
I didn't know you felt that way about me.
Danny's eyes remained fixed on the ground, trying to find the courage to speak his truth.
From the first time I saw you, I knew you were the most beautiful girl I've ever seen.
Danny gulped, the weight in his throat growing tenfold to replace the weight lifting from his chest.
I've always wanted to tell you, I wanted it to be perfect.
Betty's finger gently touched Danny's chin, lifting his head until their eyes locked. The slightest smile found its way across her face.
You know what I think? This is about the most perfect way I could have hoped for.
Danny felt a smile of his own now. The faces of these two now glowed brightly in their first moment together, and in the glow of the day's last rays of sun, the two leaned into one another, sharing a kiss that would become the start of many more moments that they would share. Marty looks on in silent admiration, chuckling to himself at the utter unlikeliness of the union before him. Having remembered his own piece of his heart, Marty retrieved the clock tower flyer, flipping it over to its blank side. The note, "I love you, 555-4823, had returned. He had done it. For the second time, he had saved his future. And after all he had went through to do it, he was damn well hoping to avoid doing it a third time. As he got lost in the memories stored in the handwriting before him, he idly remembered the existence of the watch on his wrist. The sudden realization hit him with the force of 100 of Biff's right hooks. 7:54 p.m. George, satisfied with the finality of his triumph, turned to face Marty.
Oh, thank you, Marty. I don't know if we could have done it without...
But Marty was nowhere to be seen. In his place, a new voice approached from down the street.
Over here, officers! That's his car there!
The ensemble of teenagers looked on at the delirious form of Biff as 4 uniformed men encircled him. 2 men wore the garb of those who served sandwiches and shakes, while the 2 exiting the car behind them wore the uniforms of those who saw justice done to those who undermined it. George, Lorraine, Danny, and Betty glanced at one another for the briefest moment, then wordlessly slipped behind the front door of George McFly's home. The door shut on the sight of them looming above him, waiting for him to return to the land of the living.
Where in the hell could he be?
Emmett Brown paced back and forth frantically, pondering how such simple instructions could have been so grossly unheeded. Should he go out and look for him? No. What if he arrived and he wasn't there? What if he was in trouble? What could he hope to do to alleviate that trouble? What sort of trouble could he have wallowed into anyway? And how was he supposed to load this damn DeLorean on his own? If the lightning bolt had been a once-in-a-lifetime chance, then the miracle Emmett Brown had personally engineered would be comparable to a major historical event. And if his passenger through space-time failed to show...
Doc!
Dr. Brown whirled on his heels. Marty was running at Olympian speed up the driveway to his abode. Thank God, Emmett thought. For a deity who he had sought to undermine for most of his life, it would seem that the all-powerful Lord was a forgiving one.
Marty!
Emmett ran to meet his future pupil, now breathless as he doubled over.
Where on earth have you been? I thought I would have to send the time machine back empty.
Marty grinned.
Thanks for waiting on me, Doc. You will not believe what just happened.
Tell me about it on the way. We have a schedule to keep. Our backers are not known for their patience.
Backers? Doc, who are these guys? What did you do?
In the car, Marty. Get moving.
From their lookout at the top of the switchback, the Hoover Dam sat silent underneath the stars in the night sky. Nestled neatly in the jagged and craggy canyon, the smooth, symmetrical structure stood sentry to the forces of Mother Nature that were once beyond the control of human minds. And yet, this Goliath structure now stood where nothing once existed, a testament to the will of human minds to defy the confines of their reality. Tonight, it would once again be a key contributor in redefining what humanity understood about reality. After 6 non-stop hours on the nighttime road from California to Nevada, Marty McFly and Dr. Emmett Brown admired the view where the magnificence of the man-made and the serenity of nature came together as one.
I cannot believe you pulled this off.
Doc shrugged in amusement.
If I'm being honest, I'm not sure I do either.
Marty glanced towards him.
So tell me again.
Doc cocked his eyebrows, looking down at Marty with anticipation.
How the hell did you convince the Department of Defense to let you do that?
Doc balked, suppressing a chuckle as he reminisced on the events of a week that could occupy its own chapter in an already storied life.
Let's just say when you bring up Manhattan Project secrets, they have a much harder time ignoring you.
Marty stepped forward, bringing himself face to face with the good doctor.
Doc, I really cannot thank you enough for doing this. I honestly have no clue what I would have done if you weren't here. Like, this has got to be the craziest thing to ever happen to anyone, right?
Marty faltered, feeling a lump form in his throat as he forced himself to say what he needed to say for far too long.
Thank you for being the one person I can always count on. I don't say it enough. I wish I could be smart like you, Doc. I wish I could do more for you. I really wish I could.
Marty cast his gaze down. The thought of Dr. Brown's grim fate weighed heavy on his soul. and yet he could do nothing but sit back and allow fate to take one of the most cherished people in his life away from him. Why couldn't he just tell him? Why couldn't the forces of space-time just let him have this? As Marty held back a fountain of tears, a familiar hand rested on his shoulder. The same reassuring grip of his friend was just as comforting in the fiery-eyed and energized young man as it was in the wise and shifty gaze of his weathered and aged self.
Marty, if I could take one conclusion away from this encounter, it would be that meeting you is the best thing that's ever happened to me.
Marty's head lifted. He found himself lost in a set of brown eyes. A set that had been a mentor and a friend of the highest caliber.
Knowing my purpose in life is to solve one of the great scientific mysteries is far beyond anything I dared to dream. But knowing that someone cared, that someone as ingenious, dedicated, compassionate as you would stand by me, would be there to see it through with me, well, it's the greatest honor that any man could ask for.
Marty wrapped his arms tightly around Dr. Brown, the tears flowing freely down his cheeks. Emmett returned Marty's embrace, and for a moment, these two men, utterly out of time and out of place in each other's company, shared a moment that only a friendship as pure as theirs could allow.
I'm gonna miss you, Doc.
Me too, Marty. Me too.
After what felt like 30 years all on its own, the two finally parted.
Now remember, Marty, it's just the same setup as before. The generators will feed their power up to the guide wire suspended above the road. Just be sure you hit 88 miles per hour, and our channeling rod will do the rest. Shall we?
Doc Brown moved to insert the rod into the socket feeding to the flux capacitor. Marty walked over to his side.
Doc, you mind if I give you a bit of advice?
What would that be, Marty?
Marty pondered his next words carefully. This was his last chance. He couldn't risk altering time by telling the truth, but he still might be able to get through to Doc, to save him.
Be careful who you cross.
Doc furrowed his brow.
What is that supposed to mean?
Just be careful who you cross.
Marty, what are you...
Doc Brown's train of thought was cut short as he noticed something approaching on the road. There were no other cars on the road for miles. This couldn't be good. Doc reached for his pair of prototype autofocus binoculars on the floor of his Packard to inspect the oncoming vehicle. All of the muscles tightened in Emmett Brown's face as his heart sank down into his trousers.
Doc, what's the matter?
Marty had noticed the shift in the doctor's expression, and now wore one to match it.
Marty, get in the car. You need to go.
Doc, what is it?
Dr. Brown broke sight with the car to meet Marty's eyes.
It's Biff Tannen. He's found us.
Marty opened his mouth to speak, but the doc stopped him.
Get in the car, Marty. I'll keep him busy. Doc, go! Now!
Marty bolted for the DeLorean, practically diving into the driver's seat before fumbling with the ignition. But the car wouldn't start. The headlights now split from one beam into two, the speed at which they approached becoming faster and faster. Marty turned the key over and over, slamming into the accelerator.
Come on, just this once.
The outline of the car was now visible behind the headlights. It would not be long before the Ford convertible would meet them in the switchback. Not long before they were run off the road. The DeLorean sputtered weakly as Doc slammed on his horn in protest. Time was almost up.
Goddamn stupid DeLorean piece of...
Marty slammed his fist into the flux capacitor, sending out a burst of energy that caused the DeLorean to roar to life. Marty slammed on the gas, beginning his downhill descent to the Hoover Dam. Marty was relieved to see Doc Brown following, but it was small comfort compared to the sight of the second set of headlights emerging from around the bend, utterly unabated despite the near impossible turn. Marty turned to the gauge. 43 miles per hour. Biff was gaining on him, though Doc was keeping him distracted with his flatbed for now. 50 miles per hour. The road was beginning to bend. Marty needed every ounce of focus if he hoped to reach the magic 88. 55 miles per hour. Biff had now gotten ahead of the dock and was prodding Marty's bumper, trying to send him off-road. 62 miles per hour. Even as Marty felt jolt after jolt against his bumper, he refused to let off. He was coming up on the stretch of road leading over the dam. No turning back now. 67 miles per hour. Marty looked back, watching Duck as he nudged his way in front of Biff. Biff, it seemed, was relenting for now, unwilling to risk ruining the fresh coat of paint on his car. 71 miles per hour. Something was wrong. Doc was waving frantically out of his window at Marty, pointing at him and then above him. The channeling rod. 76 miles per hour. Marty could see the guide wire now. Another jolt to the bumper, but this time it had been Doc. 82 miles per hour. Doc's window rolled down. He reached and reached until it seemed he might pop in half. Nothing. Doc lurched forward now. Biff was back at their heels. 86 miles per hour. Marty tried to bump Doc's car, hoping a jostle would reset the rod. Doc waved frantically to stop, even as Biff pressed his advance. 88 miles per hour. The guide rod was nearly upon him. Marty saw Doc make one last frantic gesture before speeding ahead. This was it. Marty was either going home, or Biff was sending him off the dam and into a watery grave. Marty gritted his teeth, clamped down on the wheel, and glanced the guide wire one last time as it passed overhead. Dr. Emmett Brown slammed on his brakes, desperately trying to stop himself from being flattened by the canyon wall at the end of the road. Wincing at the sound of screeching rubber, Doc Brown clenched, willing the car to come to a stop. As if answered by Newton himself, the car abandoned its forward motion, mere feet away from the looming wall before him. Just as Doc eased off his wheel, a dark car flew past him, turning its wheel frantically to avoid the oncoming dead end. The effort was in vain, and Doc's stomach dropped as the car scraped against the side of the canyon wall with a hair-raising squeal before violently bouncing back into the middle of the road. The car, now brutally mangled and twisted, lay still. Oh no, please, no! Doc dove from his vehicle, rushing to Marty's aid.
Why? Why couldn't you do it, Emmett? He was counting on you and you failed him. How could you?
But as his mind plummeted into the bowels of grief, a small piece of data lodged itself within his synapses, pulling Emmett from his emotional dive. The wrecked car didn't have a top. In fact, it looked nothing at all like the boxy and angular future mobile that had nearly lost its channeling rod. Dr. Brown turned. Behind him, there were now 2 long ribbons of flame imprinted into the road. Hanging limply from the guide rod above was the flux capacitor's channeling rod, and on the ground below, a set of jumper cables Doc brought to try and boost the damn DeLorean. Doc had thrown those cables in a last-ditch effort to catch and realign the channeling rod. It had worked. Doc had done it. Dr. Emmett Brown let out a cry of joy, relief, and wonder so powerful that it shook the stars above, as the tapping of his dancing feet shook the foundation of the Hoover Dam below. Soon, though, a new sound joined the doctor's orchestra. Grunts of anger. Emmett Brown was brought down from his euphoria as he watched Biff Tannen viciously kicking the side of his car. Each blow became louder and louder until Biff let out a primal, furious cry, collapsing to the pavement next to his car. Dr. Brown approached the battered Ford, extending his hand to the young man.
Get away from me, you goddamn nutcase!
Biff batted Doc Brown's hand away, still fighting to maintain his air of intimidation. But Doc saw through it, just as plainly as he could map electricity's travel through a machine. This was just a kid who was lost and scared, and was now forced to see that for himself. He didn't deserve to suffer for a lifetime because of the arrogance of his youth. But he would need to learn his lesson, perhaps in a way less cold than the back of a hand or the leather of a belt.
You know something, young man?
Doc Brown shifted his weight onto the frame of the car, letting himself slide down to the ground, seated next to the young Tannen.
You have poured everything you have into living life for its thrills. All you care about is doing what you want when you want, and you don't care about anyone or anything unless it's in your way. You know why I know that?
Biff's gaze remained fixed on the ground, breathing heavily as he felt the urge to plant his fist in this man's jaw grow.
Because it's exactly the same way I live my life.
Biff's animated huffs suddenly stopped, though his gaze remained planted squarely on the pavement.
It's a hard life. You spend so much time doing what you can, but getting nothing in return. It's a lot harder still when no one seems to care. And try as you might, you can't make them understand, much less make them care. So we push harder and further, don't we? Hoping that if we keep going long enough, something will happen that'll make it worthwhile. But the further you go, the harder it gets. And before long, you lose your way. And all anyone will have to tell you is that you should never have gone down that way in the first place.
Biff cautiously looked up towards Dr. Brown, his face softened, wearing an expression he had fought to beat out of himself almost as hard as his grandmother had. One of sadness.
Now, the way I see it, you can go back to Hill Valley tonight and pretend everything is normal. You can keep doing exactly what people expect you to do.
Dr. Brown turned his head, locking eyes with Biff.
Or you could start down a new path and see where it takes you.
Biff sat silently, letting the dormant gears in his brain turn for the first time in a long time.
Now, let's say we do something about that car.
The blinding light before Marty quickly dissipated, now replaced with a massive canyon wall moving in on him faster than light. He floored the brake, steering desperately into the curve of the road. The DeLorean screeched to a halt, mere inches away from the imposing barrier of stone. Marty exhaled, leaning back into his seat as he let his body go limp. He looked down at the DeLorean's present time clock, idly observing the light of day through the windshield as it slipped behind the horizon. 10:25, 1985, 1900 hours. He was back.
God love you, Doc. You did it.
Marty's face turned, his mind now magnetically drawn to one thing.
Doc.
He had to save him. He still had a chance. Marty fiddled with the key, hoping and praying the DeLorean would still have some life left to give. Fortunately, the DeLorean did not seem interested in tempting fate, and roared to life with little coaxing. The 6-hour drive from the Hoover Dam back to Hill Valley was the most draining 6 hours of Marty's life. Not only was his brain in full panic mode, but the only thing to dull the alarm was an endless expanse of dark, barren wasteland, flatter than the winning performance at the Battle of the Bands. If only he had spare time to check out Las Vegas. The clock's time shifted forward unflinchingly. Oh God, just let me be on time. Marty was now on his final approach to the Twin Pines Mall. 1:32. Shit! He had to hurry. Marty pulled up on the road overlooking the fateful scene that had changed his life. But as he threw the front door open and started running to the mall side, the sound of gunfire erupted, sending Marty down to the ground in instinctive fear. That was it. He had failed. Doc was gone. After watching himself disappear into the fabric of space-time, and watching the terrorist's van disappear into the 1-hour film kiosk, Marty found his feet, bolting down the hill to Doc's side. Though devastated, Marty does not have long to languish in his sorrow. Dr. Emmett Brown rises from the ground, revealing a shocked but very much living face, with a bulletproof vest under his suit and scraps of torn paper taped together to form the letter Marty wrote him in 1955.
What about all that talk about screwing up future events? The space-time continuum?
Well, the way I figured, a bit of advice never hurt anybody. Doc returns Marty home, and after some much-needed rest, Marty woke to what somehow managed to be the biggest shock in a week full to the brim with them. His siblings, now slick and straight-laced, his parents, now successful and lively, and Biff, now lowly and subservient. Was this real? Was this Marty's life? Didn't seem like it to him.
She is such a sweet girl. Say, Marty, isn't tonight the night of the big date?
What, Ma?
Well, aren't you going up to the lake tonight? I mean, Betty could hardly keep a lid on how excited she was about your first trip. Aren't you still going?
Marty was caught in a fugue state, utterly unable to understand what the hell was happening in the place he lived but didn't belong in. A flurry of motion continued around Marty in spite of his detachment from the world.
Marty, here's your keys. You're all waxed up, ready for tonight.
Marty feigned a smile, nodding at Biff as he made his way to the garage with a set of keys that had never belonged to him until right now.
Oh, Marty, tell Doc Brown I said hi when you see him, all right?
Marty shambled onwards, his body caught in a different trance from his brain. Tell Doc Brown I said hi. What the hell did he mean by that? This had to be a dream. But upon reaching the garage, Marty was ready to accept that maybe, just maybe, this was a dream worth living in. 'Cause in this dream, he had his very own Toyota SR5. He had a loving, caring family with the world at their fingertips. And best of all, he had a girl with inescapably beautiful brown eyes.
How about a ride, mister?
That's the power of...
And that will be it for today's video. So this was a bit different from the usual fare, but it was a very interesting project to put together. I had a lot of fun making this, and I can't wait to see where future videos might take me. But what did you guys think? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments, and let me know if you have any ideas for movies to reimagine and what the reimaginings of them might look like. I look forward to hearing more from you all, so until next time, I'll see you when I see you.